If Canada was previously able to look away from the tragic legacy of the Indigenous residential schools in this country, that's clearly no longer true. The discovery last week of the remains of 215 children at a former school site in British Columbia has made it front of mind as never before. With us on this shocking discovery and where we go now, let's welcome in Victoria, British Columbia, Rai Moran, Associate University Librarian for Reconciliation at the University of Victoria and former director at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. On Georgina Island, Ontario, on Lake Simcoe, Cynthia Wesley Eskimo, Indigenous Chair on Truth and Reconciliation at Lakehead University and Chair of the Governing Circle at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation at the University of Manitoba. And in Ontario's capital city, journalist Connie Walker. She is the host of the podcast Stolen: The Search for Germaine. I'm really grateful to all three of you for joining us for what will be an impossibly difficult but crucial discussion to have here on TVO tonight. Just before we start, we thought it might be useful for residential school survivors and others affected. If you need support, there is a nationwide residential school crisis line that you can contact. And here comes the phone number. It's 1-866-925-4419. That's 1-866-925-4419. That number will appear on the screen as our discussion proceeds. And if you need help, please call that number. I want to start with a quote from National Chief Perry Bellegarde of the Assembly of First Nations, who said the other day, survivors have been saying that there were a lot of deaths, a lot of burials, and a lot of unmarked graves, not only in Kamloops, but in all the residential schools. The sad part is nobody believed them. Now here's your concrete, tragic, horrific evidence of 215 bodies that have been found. That's Perry Bellegarde. And let's follow that up with a quote from Saul Mamakwa, the MPP from Kiwetanung in Northern Ontario, who said, "It is a great open secret that our children lie on the properties of the former schools, an open secret that Canadians can no longer look away from." Let's see here. Cynthia, I'm not sure there's a better place to start other than just saying what's been going through your head over the last week.
Well, just exactly that this is something that nobody can now look away from. It reminds me of the Blackwater Brothers when they first took their case to the courts, and the courts called them liars, that there was no way that the kinds of things that they said happened at residential schools happened. And they were vindicated in the end, and they were actually listened to. And now here we are with these children, and we've been talking about these children ever since, all the way back from residential schools, and now there's somebody that believes. So I've seen a lot of ceremony happening this week. There's been a lot of sadness. I have a granddaughter. My daughter is very upset, like this could have been us. So I think there's a lot going on across the country and a lot of emotions and a lot of feelings.
Rai, how about you?
I'd just echo everything that Cynthia has said. And I think for me personally, it's actually affected me quite profoundly, I would say. And I've had so many different layers of emotion that I've been working through. And one of them is this deep sadness. Another is just this deep frustration and really almost anger. Because, when I was with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I was on the statement gathering teams, I was on the document collection teams. A huge part of the work that I've been doing over the last decade was specifically to create the evidentiary record to give us this opportunity to understand what's going on here right now. And I think about all the survivors that talk to us about this very story, about their loved ones disappearing, about, what happened to babies that were born in the schools as a product of sexual abuse. I mean, these were absolutely horrific stories that we heard over and over and over again. And it felt like we were shouting into the dark for so long. So I'm pleased in a way that Canada has finally had its eyes opened and cannot look away. But I have to admit, it's frustrating that it's taken as long as it has, because survivors have been consistently and reliably telling the truth the entire way along. And we have to make sure that we continue to listen to them and believe them.
Connie.
Yeah, I think, it's been a really difficult week for a lot of reasons. My father was a residential school survivor. Both of my grandparents were at residential schools. And I think, what's definitely started during the work of the Truth and Reconciliation, but what has certainly continued has been a transformation in this country in terms of the understanding of those truths of residential school survivors. And I think this week, as difficult as it was, felt different to me in that, I think that a lot of people outside of my family and my native circle are paying attention to this and caring about this in a way that I haven't seen before. But I think there's also been a lot of sharing from Indigenous people across the country about those traumas and about the traumas that residential schools set into motion, and the intergenerational trauma that continues to harm and hurt so many families and communities. And it's been difficult to bear witness to that. To be completely honest, over the last week, it's been quite hard.
Cynthia, is this finally the moment of national reckoning that so many Indigenous people have been waiting for?
I think it's the beginning of the national reckoning, because now people have evidence. And so that's a very important part of this conversation. But also, it's not done. So there's still almost 400 other schools that have to be brought into this conversation. There's compensation that needs to be looked at. There's survivors that are really struggling with this that need some care. So this has just opened up larger and broader the conversation that we've been having over the last 20 years. Really, I think it's kind of started with Phil Fontaine's opening, but we're now deeply into it, and I think it's going to go deeper. And I think Canada had better be ready, because now the truth, capital T, is coming forward.
I don't want to assume that everybody has a really good understanding of the history of residential schools in this country, so we are just going to take a moment here to bring up some information that people may not know. And Tony Burke, if you would, you're directing today, if you could bring up this information. From the 1870s to 1996, as many as 150,000 First Nation, Métis, and Inuit children were sent to so-called residential schools funded by the federal government and often run by various churches. A total of 139 schools were identified in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. This does not include those run by provincial governments and religious orders. Most were out west, but as the map indicates, 16 of these schools were in the province of Ontario. Next bit of information. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which released its final report 6 years ago, identified more than 4,000, maybe as many as 6,000 children at residential schools who died. But Murray Sinclair, the former head of the commission, now says the number could be as high as 25,000. And the cause of death in most cases was disease, mainly tuberculosis, but abuse was a factor. Accidents were a factor. For example, fires breaking out in unsafe buildings. The deadliest years at residential schools were from the 1870s to the 1920s, but even as late as the 1940s, the death rates in the schools were up to 5 times higher than among the general Canadian population of kids as a whole. And 1/3 of the children who died, 1/3, did not even have their names recorded by school administrators. Now, Rai, you led the creation of a national archive that documented what residential school survivors experienced. What conditions in these schools would have allowed for these kinds of things to happen?
Yeah, Steve, that's a really important point that you've raised, because when we even think about something like tuberculosis, we have to understand that there's a whole bunch of factors playing out inside of these schools that are contributing to the spread, dissemination of disease. So this is all well documented in survivor statements and survivor accounts. And first of all, we have to understand the schools as being filled full of abuse and trauma. So you are not going to be well when you are being subjected to severe physical and sexual abuse on a regular and daily basis. There's all of the layers of cultural violence and trauma that's also being inflicted upon these students within the schools. So that starts, of course, with the cutting of the hair, but continues with the suppression of language and the renaming or denaming, the numbering of students, the compulsory, scrubbing of stairs with toothbrushes, all this kind of stuff that was happening. We know very clearly that the students were oftentimes extremely malnourished in the schools and were not fed foods that they were comfortable with, familiar with, and that the level of food, the amount of food, was simply inadequate. And there's been some very important studies that have been done that showed that oftentimes kids were coming into these schools above average height, above average weight, and leaving these schools below average weight, below average height, so we can trace the well-being of these students through some of the medical records that have been uncovered. Then there's just the loneliness, the pain, the being separated from family. I mean, and then the unsanitary conditions and the no hot water and the cramped living conditions and these schools that were poorly built and poorly funded and poorly run and just tragic. So all of this was contributing to the spread of disease, the spread of heartbreak, and let's just put it this way. In 1905, Dr. Peter Bryce called what was happening in the schools an absolute travesty. He released a paper in 1921 that called it a national crime. That's what this is. That's what we have to understand this is. This is a national crime. It's a national shame. What happened to those kids is absolutely inexcusable.
And we've known it for more than 100 years.
Exactly.
Connie, can you just really take us back to basics in the history here? What was the whole point or intention of residential schools in the first place?
Well, I think, the intention was clear from the start. The goal was to assimilate Native kids, to remove them from their families, communities, cultures, to try to assimilate Indigenous kids. I think that was very clear that was the intention. I think that what we discovered, through the work of the Truth and Reconciliation and hearing from survivors, was that the damage and the impact on the children, who some were as young as 4, 5, 6 years old, who were sent to these schools, experienced, years and years of incredible harm, going beyond, loss of culture and language, which is all, of course, devastating. But the level of abuse and the level of physical and sexual abuse that the children experienced is horrifying. A lot of my work has been centered around trying to understand the impacts of residential schools and how they're continuing to impact our communities. And in doing that work, we've done some really deep dives into individuals who went and trying to learn as much as we could about their experiences. And what I, have learned, in the research is like a lot of children didn't get to go home at all. They started these schools when they were 4, 5, 6 years old, and some didn't get to go home until they left when they were in grade 8. I think that 6 years ago, I was in Ottawa covering the final Truth and Reconciliation event in Ottawa, and the Chief Commissioner, Justice Marie Sinclair, said to a room full of survivors and media that there's not a single Indigenous person in this country that has not been touched by the legacy of residential schools. And it's so important to acknowledge that truth and to understand it, but also to acknowledge how that is continuing today, that this is not something that happened 100 years ago and is over, that this is something. The last school closed when I was in high school.
Yeah, that'd be the last school closed, I guess, in the mid-1990s. So, Cynthia, I wonder if you'd pick up the story there, because a lot of people are going to be asking, wait a second, most of this happened 100 years ago. The last schools have been closed for 25 years. How is it, as Marie Sinclair said, that every single Indigenous person in this country is still touched by this? Can you explain that?
Because, well, we talk about the legacy effect. We talk about the intergenerational impact. We talk about epigenetics. We talk about adverse childhood experiences, all of the things that have been handed down generation by generation. And we're trying to work with communities as a whole, and sometimes individuals, to help them understand that their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents, that all of that stays in the genes and it's being handed down to them. And so we have to think about that and try to heal that hurt, because hurt people. And we still have a fair number of people in our communities that are suffering. They don't understand always why they're suffering. Some of them have not had the stories of residential schools told to them. Many parents were ashamed or are frightened to tell their children because they didn't really want them to understand. We've seen that with the records, destroying the records. The parents don't want people to really understand their own families. They don't really want them to know how bad it was for them. So we have a lot of work to do in that regard, but that legacy effect is going to continue if we don't support it and we don't do something that's going to help change that trajectory.
Rai, can you tell us, how much do you think parents at the time who were sending their children to residential schools, not by choice in many, many cases, obviously, how much did they know about what was going on in those schools?
Well, I think the point that you just made there, that it was non-voluntary, forced conscription into these schools is very, very important. We have to remember that this was Canadian law through the Indian Act that forced parents to send their kids to school and threaten those same parents with jail and or fines if they did not. We also have to remember that there are entire systems, such as the PASS system, that prevented parents from going and visiting their children and or rescuing their children oftentimes. And we also have to remember that there's this whole narrative within the residential school system that's actually super problematic and absolutely heartbreaking, wherein once these kids were taken, so often what would happen is that the process of assimilation, the process of turning the kids against the parents started right away, because the whole purpose of these schools, the very, very purpose, was to separate kids from their cultures, identities, languages, families, governance systems, legal systems, health systems, knowledge systems. And that involved teaching these kids that their parents were wrong, that they were unfit to be their parents, that they were literally, in the words of the school, savages. So kids were being told that their parents were wrong. Meanwhile, the parents were being forced to and threatened by Indian agents and others, saying, don't you even think about going up and seeing your kid. And we've heard stories of children being trapped, locked in these residential schools, seeing their families out the window, but being told by the teachers in those schools that forget about your parents, they don't even want to see you, and threatening them that way. And that's how sick this system was in so many ways. And I think about, there's a friend, he's just recently passed away, Ted Fontaine from Manitoba, and he is a very, very brave survivor. He shared so many stories, and just to give you an indication of how the mind was twisted, he says, Rye, when we first got into these schools, they used to play us movies, and these schools were at the time cowboy and Indian movies, to use the language of the time. Says, when I first got there, we were all cheering for us, like the Indians. And he says, within 6 months, we were cheering for the Cowboys. That's how that process of, turning kids against themselves and that brutality of assimilation happened, and happened so quickly. And that's what we really have to recognize. It's heartbreaking.
Connie, I'm going to ask a difficult and no doubt unpopular question here, but I want us to tackle this. I have spoken to people who attended residential schools. Phil Fontaine, who was referenced earlier in this discussion, former national chief of the Assembly of First Nations, attended a residential school. And he said, I remember him telling me, it wasn't fabulous, it wasn't great, but not every school was the horror show that has been portrayed over the past week. Is that worth saying at a moment like this?
I mean, I'm sure it's up to every survivor to acknowledge whatever truth that they know and that they've experienced in those residential schools. But I think in that acknowledgement, we cannot lose sight of the larger truth, that this was a system that was designed to assimilate and separate Native kids from their families, that thousands of Indigenous kids experienced horrific physical, sexual, emotional abuse. Even if a survivor maybe did not experience that level of abuse or trauma, there's still what was described in the Truth and Reconciliation final report as a cultural genocide that a lot of people are questioning today, whether or not we need to even just call it a genocide in terms of what happened to Indigenous kids and families. I think that there certainly, I think, have been survivors who have shared, stories about the importance of sport or education. But I also think that we cannot lose sight of what is the bigger story here. And also, continuing to recognize how those experiences affected their entire lives in those schools, and even through the residential school settlement. Once this was acknowledged and there was an apology made to residential school survivors, and they were able to participate in the Indian residential school settlement, a lot of survivors had to go through this independent assessment process and document in detail, in horrific detail, the level of abuse that they experienced in those schools and how that was triggering and re-traumatizing and incredibly difficult for survivors. So while there may have been positive experiences, I think what we're hearing and what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission heard from so many survivors was that this was not a positive story, that this is a devastating story that continues to impact so many Indigenous children and families today.
I appreciate that clarification because, of course, there is a competing narrative, and I want to make sure that you had a chance to speak to that. And Cynthia, maybe I'll get you to follow up on that, because although you did not go to residential schools yourself, you did grow up in the 1960s. You did have a sense of them. You did know other Indigenous kids who went to them, and you saw what happened to them when they would rejoin the community. What can you share on that front?
Well, both my parents also went. My mother went for 8 years, and my stepfather went when he was 4 years old. And he, as Connie said, he didn't get out of there until he was 16. So he was a very unhappy man. There was a lot of violence in our home. There was a lot of alcohol abuse, and there was sexual abuse. All of those things were happening. And my mother said, even if she described some of the circumstances that she had experienced and said, like, is that abuse? Like, they didn't really know. They were kids. And kids want to move towards life, so that that was one thing. But she said the main thing that really hurt her and a lot of people, even if there was no direct abuse, was that they didn't have their parents, that they grew up in a circle with other girls, but they were not allowed to interact with boys. And so they didn't get that natural experience of learning how to interact with the other sex, and learning how to be in relationships and build friendships. And so we see a continuing problem with domestic violence in our communities that has been intractable. Like, we have not been able to stop it. And so we have to come back and understand that even though they may not have gotten terrible things happening directly to them, they were still deeply affected by it. It still affected our relationship. My mother, I don't think my mother hugged me until she was in her 60s, and I had to really kind of force it and teach her how to do that, so that when she had grandchildren, she had the opportunity to actually interact with them in a different kind of a way than she did with me. So we need to understand that it's still, even though she didn't abuse me, just her inability to understand what love felt like and hugging and relationship was also had an effect on me. And I had to really work hard with my daughter, and on. Like, we have to do something about this. It's really, really pervasive across the entire country.
Well, one of the questions, Rye, that people are asking all across the country now is, all right, the people who set up these schools, they're all dead. The people who taught at them 100 years ago are all dead. Who do we hold responsible for this chapter of Canadian history today in 2021? What's the answer to that?
Yeah, well, I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action are pretty clear on asserting and finding, not asserting, but literally finding through evidence that this is a Canadian problem, and this is a Canadian issue, and this is Canadian history. Therefore, it requires all Canadians to redouble in their efforts to repair and heal through this terrible time that we're living through. And especially, when we look at the history of Indigenous peoples in this country, I mean, it's not like we're going back to some sort of, perfect relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in this country. We have to build a new relationship, one built on mutual respect, trust, care for one another, and fundamentally the recognition of and fundamental assertion of Indigenous rights, because the schools themselves, in every way, shape, and form, were a violation of the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples. So what we have to do now is fundamentally recognize that this is a long-standing history of genocide and breach of human rights. And the solution to that is a path towards human rights and a path towards respect for the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples. So the commission says, there's things that we should do. We should make, really important commitments to one another through things like a new royal proclamation and through things like a new covenant on reconciliation that allow us to say with the greatest weight possible that we have in this country that we will never, ever let this happen again, and we are going to end the violence. And then we see a whole series of steps that are necessary to ensure both that we continue to build the evidentiary record and continue to build the overall historical record and continue to create the spaces necessary to understand this and grieve this history that we have through protection of sites and ongoing research, and obviously this very important work on missing children. And then we have to hold ourselves to account. So we need transparency. We need production of records on how many kids are in care, and maternal health and infant mortality and the number of people incarcerated. And we need a national council on reconciliation to report out each and every year on whether or not we're actually hitting the marks in terms of improving this fundamentally broken relationship. So it's promise making, it's commitment to a new relationship, it's a recognition of human rights through the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and then absolutely it is transparency and accountability in a way that we've never seen before, because this country has been absolutely unwilling to and unable to really be accountable to the original inhabitants of this land. And what we're seeing right now is all Canadians recognizing that this country has absolutely failed Indigenous peoples yet again. And that's why this travesty of what's happened at Kamloops has been, such an awakening for Canadians, because they're seeing once again what the lived experiences of Indigenous peoples has been like in this country.
No, right. I appreciate that list. And there are, I mean, you've listed many, many positive things that can be done as Canada and Indigenous people look to the future. But Connie, let me pick up on one word you said there, Rye, and that's accountability. I want to know, Connie, do Indigenous people who live in Canada today, do they want to sue the Catholic Church out of existence? Do they want to sue the Anglican Church or the United Church out of existence? Because they were, of course, responsible for the establishment and running of these schools. I mean, presumably they want apologies from religious leaders, and that's one thing. But what about the next step? Do they want that?
I mean, I think accountability is obviously a huge component here that a lot of people are talking about. Accountability for sure from the churches, but accountability also from the Canadian government that goes beyond the apology and the residential school settlement. I think there's also, we need to talk about accountability in terms of the journalism institutions and the other public institutions in Canada, and what we are what has been largely ignored. Is now, people are paying attention. These conversations are happening in a way that I don't think they have before. But certainly, this is also just the beginning. That this is something, as we've all said, that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission uncovered in great detail and published in great detail in their final report 6 years ago. There were 94 calls to action. There was, the beginning of starting to pay attention to that. But what has happened in the last 6 years in terms of accountability for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action? What has happened in journalism organizations across the country in terms of our commitments to improve representation and the coverage of stories that, we have a dismal history of misrepresenting or underrepresenting Indigenous stories in all newsrooms in Canada. And so I think there are a lot of places to look for accountability as we move forward.
Connie, the Prime Minister said he'd do all 94. How's he doing?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's a great question. I think that a lot of people, a lot of my colleagues have pointed out that there hasn't been a ton of progress on the calls to action in the last 6 years. This government said that their relationship with Indigenous people was the most important relationship. And I think that, what led to that statement and what has transpired in the last 6 years, I think, is really an understanding, probably by all of the political parties, that Indigenous rights are important to Canadians, and that these are important issues for Canadians, and they have to respond. But I think absolutely, like, journalists need to be asking those hard questions to all levels of government.
Cynthia, the Pope has yet to apologize. Would it matter to you if he did?
Well, it wouldn't necessarily matter to me because I'm not Catholic, but I know that the Catholic community is saying the Pope needs to take some responsibility for this. I have heard from Catholic people that I know that have sent me emails and stuff that said, yeah, I think something has to happen here. We didn't really know the depth of this, and we didn't really understand it, and now we understand it better, and we want to see that happen. The hospitals, the medical profession is also stepping up, and a lot of people on the ground level are stepping up and understanding that there's, that they need to make changes as well in terms of cultural safety safety and ensuring that the kinds of things that have happened over the past year in our hospitals in Quebec and in across Canada don't continue to happen. So we have to deal with stereotypes, and we have to deal with, you know, the kind of history that people think they know when they actually don't. And we have to, you know, there's a lot of correcting that's going to happen. And whether the churches step up or not, I think they're going to have to be forced to step up. I think this is the time, because the Catholic Church has not come to the table when we've talked about covenants. They have not, they've been let off the hook when it came to actually raising funds for this. Under the Harper government, they were told, okay, then it's not, you don't have to come up with that money now. And I think that we have to go back and say, yeah, actually you do. This is partly your responsibility to ensure that this money is made available and that people have it in their community so that they can do the healing that they need to do.
Well, let me ask you about the current federal government, because it was, as Connie points out, 6 years ago that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came forward with recommendation, calls to action, and there was a specific call to ask the federal government to find and preserve the resting places of all the children who died at these schools. This has not happened yet. Why not?
Well, money has been allocated. I understand from yesterday that the minister, Minister Bennett, said that the money has not rolled out to the communities because they weren't ready. But I think they are ready. They have been ready, and the money should absolutely be sent out. The National Center is part of that conversation, and we've been doing the archival work and making sure that the names are being found. But the money has to come out of the federal government. It has to go to the communities, and the communities have to lead this process. This is about them, about their families, their ancestors, their children. And I think they need to be deeply engaged in this. And I think that has been a problem over the course of time, where our survivors, our parents, our families were not engaged in these conversations the way they should have been. And now is the time to ensure that they are.
Yeah, Rye, we should point out, as Cynthia just has, that yes, Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett did come out yesterday with a $27 million package to locate and identify the lost children's final resting places. So that offer has been made. What else needs to happen now?
Yeah, I mean, the money has to start flowing, and I think that's when I look back at some of the action that's happened over the last number of years, is that there have been, you know, promises made, there's been gestures made, sometimes there's even been funds set aside. For example, we can go back to 2016, December 15th, 2016. At that point, you know, the Prime Minister made three very important commitments. One was some funding for the National Center for the Truth and Reconciliation to get going on some of this work. The other one was the creation of the National Council on Reconciliation, and funds have been set aside. It's the challenge here is that we have to get these funds moving fast and on an urgent basis. Like, we've had the same amount of time now pass since the close of the TRC as we had the TRC. And the big difference between the TRC and what's happened afterwards is that the funds have been controlled and trickled out and run through programs that require a whole bunch of, like, you know, just discussion and debate and just a bunch of different work. And if we take a step back and look at how much the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was able to achieve over a very, very short period of time, we can see that the clear difference between that was that those funds were more or less provided unfettered to the commission to manage responsibly, to hire the people that they needed to hire, and to conduct the work of their mandate with great care and diligence as an Indigenous-led organization. And really what we have to understand is we've got to get the funds into the hands of these Indigenous organizations, just like so many different things, so that the work can happen in a good way by people that know what they're doing.
We've got just a couple of minutes left here, and Connie, let me see if I can get one more issue on the table here. And I think it's interesting. Over the last many years, we have been talking a great deal about the reconciliation part of Truth and Reconciliation.
Mhm.
But I suspect the events of the past week remind us that there's still a lot to do on the truth angle in all of this. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. I think, you know, what we're really, what's really happening, I think, since the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has been this transformation in terms of understanding about Indigenous life in Canada, how, you know, the realities that we continue to face today, but also that connection to our history. And I think what's happened in Canada, has been that the majority of Canadians don't understand the Indigenous perspectives of that history. It was a shared history. We've lived alongside each other for 150 years in some cases, and there's still very little understanding about these Indigenous realities. For me as a journalist, it's been a huge focus and passion of mine to try to amplify Indigenous voices, to share our stories, to tell our truths about how we've been impacted by the legacy of residential schools, how we've been impacted by colonization, how generations of intergenerational survivors are impacted by the 60 scoop and by overrepresentation in child welfare, how that's led to this crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Every story that you see in the news today about Indigenous people and Indigenous communities is connected back to that history. And it's absolutely imperative that we understand the truth about it, because for so long it's been misrepresented or ignored.
I want to thank the three of you for coming on to TVO tonight and sharing your views on this hugely important topic. I'm glad you spent the time with us. I sure hope we don't have to have this conversation again soon, because hopefully that'll mean we've made some progress. Rye Moran, Cynthia Wesley Eskimo, Connie Walker, stay safe, be well, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.